So what is mental health? There is a lot of misunderstanding. We use this word a lot, and especially lately it's used a lot, but I find that people tend to mean very different things about it. And there's a lot of misconceptions about it, and even just the language of mental health, when we're looking at it from within an Islamic perspective, is somewhat misleading and misdirected when we're thinking of mental health. So some of the common misconceptions, particularly within the Muslim community, I would say, is that mental health is just, and I'm saying mental health is just a problem of crazy people, or people that have problems, or this Arabic word that people use, majnoon. It means sort of, people use it to mean crazy, like there's something wrong with these people. And within that, there's a misconception that mental health is the same thing as mental illness. So oftentimes we talk about people having mental health problems as if those are a small section of the population that has nothing to do with us, when really this is not the case, and we'll touch on this. Also, particularly within the Muslim community, there's always this focus on jinn, that if somebody has an issue and somebody's sort of acting out of sorts or not normal, that it must be a jinn. Now, within the belief and within the Islamic tradition, we accept that there are jinn and that jinn can impact people. However, clinically speaking, statistically speaking, from my experience, from my colleagues' experience, the number of cases where jinn is actually the issue when people think it's the issue is very minimal. It can be, but usually it's not. And then there's this statement that we often hear. Sorry for those of you who might not be able to see. I'll try to say everything to you. I know there's on the peripheral. We always hear this statement, so if only you just had more iman, more faith, then you wouldn't have problems. You wouldn't struggle with these mental health issues if you just do your prayers, if you just have more iman, and you're a strong Muslim in your faith, you shouldn't have any problems. Misconception. And this notion that it's all in your mind, it's all in your head. And what I mean by that is some people it's like, oh, just change your thoughts, just get over it, you're making it up, and all you have to do is sort of just not think this way and you won't be this way. And the reality is that it's much more complicated than that. And so to dispel some of these misconceptions and dispel this, and because of these misconceptions, there's a stigma with mental health. And I would say definitely in the Muslim community, but also in regular secular society as well. There's more of a precedent in secular society for seeking mental health treatment, but it's still stigmatized. So mental health is a concern for everyone. Every single person in this room needs to be conscious of, concerned with, and promoting and benefiting their mental health. And it's not something that you either have or don't have. It is a continuum. And what we often misconstrue is when we say mental health, oftentimes we're meaning mental illness. And when we talk about mental illness, we're misconstruing it as something that is a problem, or something that the person is weird, or that they're not normal, or right. And it's much different. There's many more nuances to it, because mental illness or struggles with having mental health can be both a biological cause and circumstantial causes. So, and this, we'll talk a little bit about the roots of Islamic psychology from the Islamic tradition going back to the early 8th century. But the very first person to talk about this distinction was Abu Zayd al-Balkhi in the 9th century. So we're talking, 10 centuries before people were even talking about something called psychology as an academic discipline. He talked about the difference between exogenous depression and endogenous depression. So that there are chemical imbalances, biological reasons for why somebody would have mental health issues or mental illness. And there are life circumstances that can also create and cause that. And it's not one or the other, it can be both. And oftentimes, because we're more oriented towards physicality and we want things to be solved easily, we tend to, especially in this contemporary world, people want a fast fix. They want to take a pill to get something good to go away. So oftentimes things that aren't biological are treated as if they are biological by treating with medicine, when it can actually be something that is internal through a process of self-awareness that we'll talk a bit about. Like I said, the majority of cases are not due to jinn. And that is statistically speaking. And it's something that I think people need to learn to understand and learn to know what signs there are for when somebody is struggling, when somebody is affected, versus a spiritual ailment versus a emotional, cognitive state. And there it's very integral. So being a person of faith, having strong iman as a Muslim or as anybody of faith, does not mean that you don't struggle with mental health. Period. Everybody is going to struggle with making sense of this really difficult life that we're in all the time. The state of the human being, from an Islamic perspective, the state of the nafs, the self, is constantly fluctuating. And the Prophet ﷺ said that the heart of the human being is like a bubbling pot of water. And that these bubbles that come to the surface are our reactions to life circumstances. There's all kinds of things going like this all over the world, chaos, craziness that we can't control. And if we're not controlling what we can control, our internal self, then we're going to react to it and go like this, go up and down. We're going to have times when we're feeling really good, times when we're feeling really low. Right? We know that even the Prophet, ﷺ, who was the best of creation, who was constantly connected to Allah, was sad. There was the year of sadness, right? There's times of being down, it's part of the human experience. And the Prophet ﷺ would counsel the Sahaba with matters in life, and constantly we hear of struggles. The reason that we hear of the companions of the Prophet, they're examples for all these different ways of life and examples of how do we deal with when things are difficult, when we get down, when we have relationship problems, when we get out of sorts, when we get disconnected from remembering God. How do we deal with that? And we find guidance throughout the Islamic tradition on exactly that, of how to keep balance and keep this wasatiyah, this balanced middle path. And so this idea that it's all in your head, or we are not our thoughts, meaning it's much more than just thinking. It's not just, okay, I'm going to change the way that I think and therefore I'm going to be able to change my state of being. Because we are holistic human beings, we are holistic beings, and our experience is centered in our being that is not just our thoughts. And so let's talk a little bit more about that, because it goes back to a different paradigm of how we understand mental health, psychology, all of these things, if we're looking from within an Islamic paradigm. So mental health from an Islamic paradigm, and the reason why I have quotes in mental health is because of this idea that it's holistic. We are not just, talking heads where all of our center of our identity is in our thoughts. This is a different conception, different philosophy than what Islam teaches in terms of tawheed, in terms of oneness and integration, which is also reflected in the human being. So mental health is a holistic paradigm that includes physical health. It includes social health. It includes emotional health and spiritual health. So it's, we talk about, often now in medicine, we're talking about the biopsychosocial, right? They're looking at all these different factors. But in this case, spiritual, so it's bio, yes, psychological, social, yes, but spiritual is fundamental when you're looking within this framework of how we understand the human being, that is a spiritual being. There's a French philosopher that says we're not physical beings having a spiritual experience, we're spiritual beings having a physical experience. And this idea of, from an Islamic perspective, mental health, it's grounded in the theology. It's not theology that is just this abstract philosophical musings of things, but it's practical. It is something that can be, the reason that we understand and we read in the Quran about these things, they're laws for the human being to understand how to live in balance given all of the ups and downs of life. All of the things that the Quran sets out are to create a balanced, holistic, healthy human being on all these different spheres. And that conception of the human being and of health includes the soul integrally. So we can't talk about physical health with it being divorced from spiritual health, the state of the soul. Because our identity from what the Quran teaches is that we are souls. We have existed before this life and we will exist after this life. We're not our thoughts, we're not just our body, we have a much longer trajectory, which therefore impacts just this mundane life as well, because this mundane life is purposeful. We're supposed to be connecting with the whole pattern of Allah's creation within our lives. And so if we look at the Islamic tradition, like I said, going back, these scholars in the 8th, 9th, 12th, 11th, 12th century were writing and doing incredibly detailed studies of ilm an-nafs, which is the Arabic that means the study or the science of the self, of the soul. Way before this word psychology came about, right? And the word psychology in the Greek means the study of the soul. It's ironic that today you go at Cambridge University, if you study psychology, there's nothing about the soul, right? So it's a misnomer. So what we're trying to do is reclaim this word and bring the soul back into psychology, because this is how it started. This is where the roots of it were. And so in the Islamic tradition, there wasn't a field called psychology because it wasn't necessary, because in every field of knowledge, theology, kalam, fiqh, Islamic law, akhlaq, behavior, character development, it's all about the development of the human being. So psychology would be spread out in all these different branches of knowledge within the Islamic tradition because it's integral. And so when we look at these early Muslim scholars, they were all, or a lot of them, were polymaths, meaning they had knowledge of lots of different fields of knowledge. And yes, it's because they're brilliant, but it's also because it was necessary in order to understand Islam. You have to understand all these different sciences because they're integral to each other. It's very different than when you go to the university and you have the Department of Anthropology, the Department of Sociology, the Department of Psychology, Department of Biology, and they're completely separate from each other. I can have a PhD in psychology and know nothing about the biology or the physical body, and that's not how it was in the Islamic tradition. Because there's this integral understanding of the human being and of health. So therefore, the physicians, the scholars who are known as physicians, were also theologians. They had to have a deep understanding of theology because it's not this abstract philosophy that you just stays in the mosque. It's practical, which is why we are blessed to have imams like Imam Siyad. Oftentimes the khutbah is talking about look at yourself, and showing how the Quran tells us to take action, and it's practical. It's not just theoretical. It's not just abstract. And so the healing and the health, even when they were doing things like hijama, like cupping, this is tied into understanding where is the human being out of balance in their soul and their body. And so the beautiful thing is, it wasn't a separation of body, mind, and soul. It was, you can't treat one without the other. There's a beautiful way of understanding this from Mullah Sadra, who's a little bit of a later scholar. He said that the body is a dense manifestation of the soul. It's beautiful because instead of seeing it as the body is just this casing for the soul, and we just have to take care of it just while we're here, that actually our physical health is integral to our spiritual health. And that we need to approach it in this way. And this is an incredible legacy within the Islamic tradition is the hospitals, the Dar al-Shifa. These were houses of healing that was the original model for like a mental health institution. And they were doing incredibly innovative work. So in the Ottoman era, there was all of these, all throughout the Muslim world, but there was a lot of work in the Ottoman era where they were developing treatments. So here in this picture, they're doing music therapy. They have this whole system of the maqamat, these different ways of playing music that affect the state of the human being, the state of the soul, the state of somebody's mind. And so they would be dealing with people who have mental illnesses or mental health imbalances. They would be in this hospital and they would be playing music. There was water therapy, listening to different sounds. There was aromatherapy with flowers and herbs. There was holistic herbal medicine, all to treat what we're calling now mental illnesses. It was all these things: sound, physical, natural remedies. And this is a really beautiful tradition that we really need to revive. And the world is sort of starting to catch up. Holistic alternative medicine is becoming more and more recognized and understood as something that is legitimate. So now, like I said, if you go to Cambridge University and you go to a talk on psychology, or you read a book on psychology, you're going to see a picture that looks like this. The picture is of a brain with like synapses in it, right? And it's this severed head. It's just a head, no body. This is what we in the West and in contemporary society, which is sort of permeated even beyond the West, is that we understand the human being as their thoughts. I think, therefore I am. Cogito ergo sum. This is René Descartes, Cartesian dualism. And so the only thing that is focused on is the brain as this materialist, separate entity that produces the thoughts in the brain that then is the identity of the human being. And so why the focus is because the world sort of post-enlightenment and modernity has divorced spirituality and the sacred from knowledge. And so this word epistemology means, how do we know what's true? How do we know what is knowledge? And so there's a huge epistemological bias in the academic and in science that we only see legitimate what is able to be seen and measured. And if we read the Quran, we're talking about the unseen reality. Allah is talking about the unseen reality as a reality, not as a fictional fantasy, but as something that's real. Not that precludes or says that what is measurable and scientific is wrong. It is also real. But there are multiple dimensions of reality that need to be taken into consideration within an Islamic perspective. And so this mind-body dualism is why we hear things like mental health when we're talking about the state of somebody's being, and whether I'm depressed or whether I'm feeling okay or whether I'm feeling out of control. We look to the mind and then we look to the biology of the brain, and we're trying to treat it only on a biological level. And some things can be sorted out in biology. Some things, there's chemical imbalances that can be treated with chemicals. But there's a lot more to this life than the physicality that we need to take into consideration at the same time. It's not one or the other, it's both and. So, this idea of body, mind, soul that you hear more and more of, more people in the mainstream are recognizing this, right? But the Islamic tradition offers so much more detail to understand not just mind, body, soul, but these detailed understandings of things like, we hear these terms nafs, qalb, aql, ruh, and it's a much more dynamic science of the soul, which includes the body as this manifestation of the soul, to understand who we are. This is a model that I produced in my research that is trying to map out the soul. So it's a model of the soul from an Islamic perspective. And I tried to make it, I know it can look complicated, but it could be way more complicated. There's so many detailed permutations that you can go in if you just look at theology. But what we need is to understand this in a way that, okay, well, how does it make sense to us practically so we can use it for bettering our lives? So I won't go into detail here, but just to show it's much more than just my thoughts or the brain chemistry, the chemistry or neurology in my brain. There's a whole reality that involves multiple dimensions of the human being, because there are multiple dimensions of reality in this world that need to be recognized, taken into consideration. Otherwise, we're sort of operating blindly, or like an iceberg where you're only seeing what's above the surface and completely ignoring all the things that are underneath the surface, because we can't measure them. Well, it doesn't mean that they're not real, it doesn't mean they're not impacting you, and doesn't mean that you can just sort of expect to be healthy by avoiding them. And, this idea that we center ourselves in ourself in the head like this, I think in COVID, everyone was on Zoom, right? And we had there was like a grid of just floating severed heads like this, right? And we're talking to each other and connecting. And for a while, that felt really good. And people were like, yes, I'm getting that connection. And then people got to a point where like, oh, that's all we need. We just need to connect on Zoom and we can communicate our ideas and thoughts. And that's how I feel connected with other people. And then I noticed about, 6 months to a year ago, people realized, oh, that's not enough. I need to be in person. Now, nobody wants to do anything on Zoom, and everybody's doing in-person events because there's an element of physicality and heart connection and heart-centeredness in your chest of where the center of our being is, in the heart. And we need to include the rest of us, which you can't see on Zoom. And so, if we look at this hadith that many people know, is in the body is a piece of flesh, which if sound, the entire body is sound. And if corrupt, the entire body is corrupt. Surely this is the qalb, the heart. Yes, the physical heart that pumps blood is central to the nervous system, it is central to the physical body, but our scholars teach us, and the Prophet taught us, that this is also, more importantly, the spiritual center of the human being, is the spiritual heart. And that is located in the same place where this blood pumping organ is, but not just, it's your sadr, your chest. And so this is where we need to be centering, from an Islamic perspective, centering our notion of self is here. And that our heart can perceive, can intuit, can know. It's not just logical intelligence, but actual spiritual intelligence, as the heart has the capacity to see things as they are, when it is not corrupt, when it is sound. And how does it sound? By removing tahliya, removing the things that are blocking the heart, and tahliya, putting in the remembrance of the unity, remembrance of God, the oneness. This is how we come into wholeness and health, and how we have a sound heart, which then affects the rest of our being. even physically. It will impact the physicality because they're interconnected. And so what does this mean? It means we need to do something actively to change our state of being. To change the state of our heart is how we get to a place of what we're calling mental health, or what I would say is afia, wellness, well-being holistically. So in the Quran, Allah says Allah does not change the condition of a people until they change what is within themselves. What is within ourselves? What is the Prophet ﷺ told us that is the center of ourself, that changes everything else? The heart. So what we can tend to do is we approach the religion as this transactional path, right? We do these behavioral things, and if we just do the behavioral things, then we'll be fine. And we disconnect from any responsibility of looking internally and changing what is within ourselves. And so we need to approach the religion of Islam transformationally, not just transactionally. So it's not just, I do these behaviors and I'll be fine. You do the behaviors because they create a container to be able to have the strength and the resolve to be able to look inward and do the work that we need to do to take self-accountability to change what is within ourselves. And that is changing our state of being, not just changing our behaviors and actions. It's not one, again, not one or the other, it's both and. So it's holistic. But it's really important that we think of this as the whole goal is transformation. So this is a term that maybe some people have heard, spiritual bypassing. This is often in spiritual communities, and we find it in the Muslim community a lot, is a tendency to use spiritual ideas and practices to sidestep or avoid facing unresolved emotional issues or psychological wounds or unfinished developmental tasks. So, like I said, we all struggle with life. If you're a human being and you're in this world of separation and chaos and disorder, you're going to be impacted by that, and you're going to have things that you need to sort out and work on. And what we can do is if we say, oh, well, if you just pray more, then it will sort out. Yes, prayer fortifies you, it connects you to God. It is an incredible tool that we must do from within the Islamic paradigm as a Muslim. Allah has given this as a way to be solid. But it's not, again, either or, it's both and. So yes, you have iman, yes, you pray, and yes, you take self-accountability and look at yourself and do the work internally. And so that means looking at what unresolved emotional issues do I have. We find that out when we get frustrated with our loved ones, when we get irritated, when we feel anger, when we feel all of these what can be called muhlikat, or things that come up as signs of turmoil internally. That's for us to look at. That guides us to, okay, where do we need to do some internal work? And this is part and parcel of Islam. It's not Islamic psychology isn't some side hobby thing. It is integral to how we practice the faith. Allah in the Quran says, He swears by the nafs al-lawama. Nafs al-lawama is the state of the self taking itself into account. Why does He swear by it? Because it is the fundamental mechanism and aspect and state of our self that will lead to our success. Through he who purifies himself is successful. So, I want to try to wrap up so that we have time for questions. So I'll just zoom through this then. So basically, the Islamic principles of Islamic wellness that I've sort of mapped out that I think are fundamental is, like I said, the heart as the center of the human being, connection with nature. Now, why is this important? Because we're trying to get in touch with our fitra, the nature of the human being. We have within us everything that we need to be aligned and healthy and whole. What we're trying to do is uncover what has blocked that. And the beautiful thing that Allah is in the Quran is constantly pointing the believer to look at nature, to look at the signs in nature, because they point to the nature of ourselves. So we find our nature in nature. So not being connected to nature and natural cycles and our nature is fundamental to wholeness and holistic health. Problems, we need to not problematize problems. Having difficulties in life, having trials and tribulations, bala, is a blessing. It's a doorway. It's an opportunity. When we get squeezed, it is an opportunity to go through the difficulty to find on the other side this healing, wholeness, connection with God. So we shouldn't try to avoid problems, because then we're just sort of kicking the can down the road. We need to be present with the problem so that we can be present to ourselves and present with God. And that's how we come into wholeness. Internal change is essential. It's not optional. It's what we're here to do. We're meant to go from what we are to what we can become. This is the trajectory of the human being, is towards development. So coming in line with your fitra, or your nature, is not going back to what you were. It's actually uncovering what your nature is and then maximizing that potential in the opportunity that we have in this life. Mercy is foundational for healing. Mercy with yourself, mercy with others, and accepting the mercy from God is fundamental to healing. You cannot take yourself into account in this jalali way or difficult way and beating yourself up. There has to be mercy, because this is how God in the Quran talks about himself as the All-Merciful. The first two names of the 99 names are Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim. Okay, so I just want to point you to practical tools. We won't go into depth because I want to go to questions. But we have within the Islamic tradition many practical tools to reflect internally. These three are really important: muraqabah, muhasabah, and tafakkur. Oftentimes we hear of, mindfulness is a big trend, and to reduce stress and to be, right? I think from an Islamic perspective, we would be more talking about heartfulness. It's about centering ourselves here, not just clearing our thoughts, but being present with ourselves to be present with God, with Allah. So I like this picture rather than this one. Allah talks about having a heart and being a present witness. Indeed, in that is a reminder for whoever has a heart and who listens while he is a present witness. Being present in the here and now is a very important practice. It's something that we have to practice doing in order to be whole and healthy. So this hudur, or presence, is something we have to cultivate, and it's about being present with ourselves so that we can be present with God and be present with what is. Oftentimes people say, I sit and I can't sit still. I can't clear my thoughts, right? Well, it's because there's a whole lot of other things covering it up that we need to deal with first so that we can be in submission. Being a Muslim technically means somebody who is just in a state of submission and therefore experiences peace. Right? It's not, when you're Muslim, it's not like just because you're carrying a card that says you're Muslim. You can be in a state of Islam. That's what makes you a Muslim. Yes. And then muraqabah, we hear this term used like as meditation, but really muraqabah means witnessing the self. So that means when I'm going throughout my day, rather than just being on autopilot, I'm studying myself. Well, why did I just react that way? Oh, or I just reacted that way. Being self-aware, being self-conscious, because when you're studying yourself, then you're collecting data to then do something about it. Whereas if we just sort of go on autopilot and every time we have a problem, we're finding who's the culprit that's causing the problem, rather than looking inward to say, well, what am I reacting to? What do I need to clean in me? Because maybe other people are doing things, but we don't have control over other people. We only have control over ourselves. So we're going to feel more in control when we focus on what we have control over, which is internal. Then after we do muraqabah, studying ourselves, we do muhasabah, taking account of ourselves. And we can do that in a journal. So I'm studying myself on a daily basis, and then at night or throughout the day, I'm saying, okay, I did this, I noticed I did that. I reacted to when this person said this thing, I was really angry. What is that about? What do I need to look at? What do I need to take account of? Umar ibn Khattab said we should take ourselves into account before we're taken into account. Al-Ghazali says we should do it like an accountant at the end of every day, keeping our books straight before we go to bed. And then Allah talks about remembering and contemplating on nature, but then as a dalil or a sign pointing to our nature. So this practice of tafakkur is contemplation, being in nature, connecting with nature, recognizing the glory and majesty of the natural world and seeing the state of the world being in a state of presence and peace. That should lead us to then being internally reflective and contemplative internally. This is going to put ourselves into balance, inshallah. So you can find, a couple Ramadans ago, I did this thing called Midnight Moments. It's about 20 lectures, little 20-minute videos, and it's very practical, and you can go through it and find tools to practice these things that will create this. And this is what it looks like. You can find it on our YouTube channel. These are some books that relate to Islamic psychology. On the table out here we have in Cambridge Muslim College table. We're not selling them, but you can read them, flip through them, and then there's a QR code to find them. And we also have a program in Islamic psychology that you can find out more about there.